All right, so let's dive into this. You guys have sent in a ton of stuff. Articles, reports, even a YouTube video transcript. And it's all about the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's been 3 years since the Russian invasion.
Seems like everyone's wondering the same thing. Is this a turning point?
Or are we about to see some major shakeups in, well, global alliances, I guess?
Exactly.
It's a critical moment for sure.
And the sources you sent,
Yeah.
BBC reports, firsthand accounts. It's a pretty complicated picture.
It really is.
We even have some insight into what Putin's saying himself.
Oh, wow.
But maybe we should start with Macron's visit to the White House. First European leader to meet with Trump since his re-election. Sounds like Macron was hoping for some, I don't know, some agreement on ending the war.
Right.
Maybe even fix some of those transatlantic issues,
Some fence mending, yeah. Well, at least on the surface, Macron was pretty optimistic. But there were some serious tensions there, especially when you look at who's paying for Ukraine's support.
Yeah, the money always comes up, doesn't it?
It always does.
Macron says Europe's been loaning money to Ukraine while the U.S. has been giving grants.
Right.
Which is interesting because Trump keeps saying Europe's going to pay those loans back eventually.
Yeah, and it gets even trickier than that. Natural resources as payback for U.S. aid.
Wow.
He's even saying he's close to signing a deal with Zelensky.
That's a pretty big demand. How are other European leaders reacting to that?
Not well. They're pushing back hard. Macron especially. He's been pretty clear that Russia should be the one paying, not Ukraine.
So we've got this back and forth about money, but then there's also the talk of peacekeeping forces. Is that a good sign? Are we making progress?
There's been talk of an agreement between France and the UK.
Okay.
Maybe even the U.S.
Yeah.
About sending European peacekeeping troops to Ukraine once there's a truce. Macron actually sees U.S. involvement there as a huge turning point.
It is interesting considering how much Trump's criticized Macron in the past.
Right. Totally. And other European leaders, too. Like, he said they weren't doing enough. Now he's praising them for being so helpful. Hard to say what he's really thinking.
Well, with Trump, it's hard to know what to expect, isn't it? But on top of that, we haven't seen any solid plan for how they're going to end the war.
Nope, not yet.
And no word from Trump about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Right.
Or about respecting its territory, keeping his borders intact. What do those guarantees even mean for those listening?
Well, basically, security guarantees would mean that powerful countries, like the U.S. probably, would promise to defend Ukraine if it gets attacked again.
So it's like insurance.
In a way, yeah. It's meant to stop future attacks by making sure Ukraine isn't alone.
So without those guarantees, it seems like any peace deal would be kind of shaky, right?
Exactly. It's like building a house on sand. You need a strong foundation of security for a peace deal to last.
Makes sense. Okay, then there's the UN vote.
Oh, yeah.
That added a whole other layer of complication to this whole thing.
Definitely did.
Let's break that down. So the General Assembly passes a resolution, right? Criticizing Russia, supporting Ukraine's territory, all pretty normal, wouldn't you say?
Except for the fact that the U.S. voted against it.
With Russia.
With Russia.
Yeah.
And Belarus and North Korea.
Wow. Okay. Some people say, the U.S. has the right to make its own decisions in foreign policy, even if that means disagreeing with allies. But what are the downsides to that?
Well, it weakens the idea of a united front against Russia.
Yeah.
Right. It also sends a message that the U.S. might put its own interests ahead of its allies, and that could damage those alliances in the long run.
And it doesn't end there, does it? The U.S. then introduced its own resolution in both the General Assembly and the Security Council.
Right.
A much weaker one, too. It didn't blame Russia for the invasion at all, didn't even say anything about Ukraine's borders.
The UK and French ambassadors were not happy. They said the U.S. didn't even warn them or try to work something out together.
Yeah.
Their point was, you don't get peace by rewarding aggression.
So while all this is happening at the UN, you've got world leaders meeting in Kyiv, pledging their continued support for Ukraine.
Right, promising financial aid, military support, and political backing.
They even talked about more military aid. And maybe even Ukraine joining the EU.
It was a big show of solidarity, which Ukraine definitely needed. And crucially, they said any ceasefire has to respect Ukraine's sovereignty with those security guarantees we talked about.
And Zelensky, he appealed directly to Trump, talked about how anxious the Ukrainian people are, how important it is for America to keep supporting them. What struck you about what Zelensky said?
It was a good reminder that this isn't just about politics and armies. Real people's lives are being torn apart by this.
So on the one hand, you have this international support, but on the other hand, you have Trump, who's, well, unpredictable, to say the least,
Totally.
and he seems to want to get closer to Putin. That creates a really uncertain situation for Ukraine.
For sure. Let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Despite everything, they've shown a ton of resilience,
Yeah.
determination to keep fighting, even though the war's kind of hit a standstill.
The sources you sent really show that, like they talk about how they took destroyed cars from the battle for Kyiv
Oh, wow.
and made them into a memorial in Irpin.
Yeah.
And they've kept the ruins of the bridge they blew up, the one they blew up to stop the Russian tanks, a symbol of their resistance.
Powerful imagery. It really reminds you that this war is far from over. The stakes are so high. Remember, 3 years ago, most people thought Russia would win easily.
Right.
But Ukraine's held on, and U.S. support has played a big part in that.
Which makes Trump's current stance all the more worrying.
It does.
There's this growing fear that he's putting his relationship with Russia above Ukraine's independence.
Yeah.
That he might make a deal that hurts Ukraine in the long run.
It's a real concern. And Ukrainian soldiers, they're drawing comparisons to when Britain tried to appease Hitler before World War II.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And it highlights the potential for history to repeat itself. One of the sources told a really moving story about two young soldiers,
Okay.
Dmytro and Maxim. They were so eager to fight when the war started, volunteered right away. Now they're really worried about what's next.
I can imagine.
They've seen so much, grown up a lot because of it. And they see those parallels to past mistakes,
It really drives home the point that this isn't just about global politics. It's about people's lives, their futures.
Absolutely. And speaking of power struggles, maybe it's time we turn our attention to the other side of this conflict, Russia.
Let's see what's going on in Moscow, how Putin's playing this whole thing. So Putin, he popped up on state TV kind of out of the blue, right?
Yeah, it was a bit unexpected.
And he was all praises for Trump.
Oh, yeah. He was really laying it on thick, talking about Trump's rational approach, his ideas.
Seems like he's, I don't know, trying to butter him up.
It definitely felt like a classic Putin move. Flattery, promises of economic benefits.
Wait, he even mentioned some big economic deals. Like he knows exactly what Trump wants to hear.
Exactly. And, while Putin's busy charming Trump, the Russian foreign minister is saying something completely different.
What's that?
He basically said Moscow's not interested in the ceasefire unless negotiations go their way.
So they're pretty confident they can grab even more territory.
That's the message they're sending, yeah. And this brings up a really unsettling possibility. What if the U.S. and Russia make some kind of economic deal? Maybe something involving those Ukrainian natural resources we talked about.
As a way to end the war.
Exactly. But what would that even mean for Ukraine? Would they basically be sacrificed just for some economic gain?
That's a pretty disturbing thought.
It is. It's like Ukraine's fate is being decided not by Ukrainians, but by backroom deals.
So we have this mess with the UN, these potential economic deals floating around. It's hard to see where things are headed.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. We have potential turning points like that peacekeeping force. But then you have these huge obstacles, like the disagreement over who pays for everything.
And all the tension at the UN.
Right. And then you factor in Trump and Putin, two leaders who are, well, let's just say, unpredictable.
You never know what they'll do next.
It really feels like anything could happen. So where does that leave Ukraine? What are the possible outcomes here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. On the one hand, you could see a negotiated settlement, maybe with help from that peacekeeping force.
If they can ever agree on it.
Right. But even then, there's so many ifs. A ceasefire, those security guarantees for Ukraine, figuring out who pays for rebuilding everything.
And Russia and Ukraine would both have to agree to it. Not exactly easy, with all the bad blood between them.
Not at all. And then there's the other possibility. What if things get even worse? Negotiations could break down. Trump could decide he's done with Ukraine. Russia could go for even more territory.
So the war drags on, maybe even gets bigger.
And that's not even thinking about the possibility of the conflict spreading to other countries.
That's a scary thought.
It is. And it's a reminder that what's happening in Ukraine affects everyone in one way or another. It's already having a huge impact on global politics, the energy market, even food prices.
So this isn't just some far-off problem.
Nope. And the longer it goes on, the worse those impacts will get. Which brings us back to something you asked earlier. What role should the rest of the world play in all of this? should they try to shape Ukraine's future?
Yeah, it's a tough question. Some people say we shouldn't interfere with other countries.
Right.
But then there's the moral question. Do we have a responsibility to help people in need?
Stop the suffering.
Exactly.
It's a balancing act for sure.
Mhm.
But I think it's pretty clear the world can't just sit back and watch. There needs to be a real push for diplomacy, for de-escalation, and humanitarian aid needs to get to those who need it. And we need a long-term plan to address the root causes of the conflict. Otherwise, it'll just happen again.
And I think it's important to remember that people need to be held accountable for what's happened.
Absolutely. Anyone responsible for war crimes, human rights abuses, they need to face justice. That's the only way to have any kind of lasting peace. Without justice, the cycle of violence just keeps going.
So as we wrap this up, I want to bring it back to everyone listening. What does this mean for you? How can you stay informed, stay engaged with this incredibly complicated situation?
The first thing is, be critical of what you read and hear. Watch out for propaganda, misinformation. Get your news from multiple sources, sources you trust.
Don't just take everything at face value.
Right. Dig deeper, ask questions, challenge assumptions. This is a topic that needs careful thought, informed debate.
And don't be afraid to get involved.
Yeah, there are lots of ways to support Ukraine. Donating to aid organizations, contacting your representatives, even just talking about what's happening.
Every voice counts. By staying informed and engaged, you can help create a more just and peaceful future. Not just for Ukraine, but for everyone.
And as you follow this conflict, you might find new angles, new insights that we haven't even touched on today.
There's always more to learn, more to understand, more to do.
That's what makes knowledge so fascinating. It's a journey, not a destination.
It really is. And as we go deeper into what you said, there's another layer to this.
Oh, yeah.
It goes beyond the politics and the fighting.
Okay.
Gets to the heart of what this means for the Ukrainian people themselves.
Yeah, the human side of things. It's easy to focus on the big picture stuff, the diplomacy, the military strategies.
Right.
But we can't forget about the individuals, their hopes, their fears, how they're coping with all this.
Their resilience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the sources you sent really capture that. They talk about how that initial shock, when the invasion first happened, that's kind of given way to this collective resilience. Ukrainians have had to adapt to a completely new reality, one where air raid sirens are just part of life. The threat of violence is always there.
It's hard to imagine.
It is.
And yet they're finding ways to rebuild, to support each other. They haven't given up hope.
They haven't. There's this quote from one of the sources that really sums it up. It says, "We are not victims. We are warriors. We will not be broken."
Powerful.
It is. It shows the incredible strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable hardship, they refuse to give up.
And that spirit, that determination, that's ultimately what will decide Ukraine's fate.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
No matter what deals are made, no matter how alliances change, the future of Ukraine is in the hands of its people. Their courage, their resilience, their belief in their right to be free.
That's what will determine the outcome of this war.
This has been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've gone through so much information.
We have.
We've looked at the centers of power, seen the reality on the ground.
We've wrestled with some really tough questions.
Yeah.
About global relations, economic interests, what war and peace even mean.
We've seen the best and the worst of humanity.
But even with all the unknowns, all the complexities, one thing's clear. The story of Ukraine is far from over.
It's not. And as this story unfolds, it's up to all of us to stay informed.
To keep talking about it, to use our voices to push for a just and peaceful end.
The future of Ukraine, in a lot of ways, depends on the choices we make as a global community. So as we finish this deep dive, think about this. What kind of world do we want to build?
And what will each of us do to make that happen? The answers, you won't find them in headlines or speeches.
You'll find them in the choices we make every single day.
Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Until